Welcome back, everyone. I just want to say thank you to all our amazing speakers. And I, for one, am really happy that we recorded this because we set them a really mean task of trying to impart a lot of useful information in 15 minutes. So I'm really looking forward to going home and screen grabbing everything when I can. I just wanted to kick off this panel with quite a practical question for you guys. So, just as important as being able to communicate your creative vision to audiences is how that's imparted to wider production teams and other stakeholders. So I was just really interested to understand what tools or programs or systems you may use in actually laying down your thoughts and relaying that vision. And does that change and evolve as you get into iterating and playtesting in live?
Who's gonna?
I mean, even if it's like back of a fag packet, it would just be interesting to know like how that works for you guys.
I come from the games industry and I learned to write in Excel in individual cells, which was useful in the sense that you learned to treat each chunk of narrative as an individual chunk that had a set of preconditions assigned to it. But that is also the worst possible example of what Owen was rightly talking about, that branching narrative is an extremely limited format and it's programmatical, and that's not necessarily right if you have real people involved. So, I mean, when I'm scripting an XR experience, I try to, one thing that I have done is, for example, I've drawn a compass rose and then essentially storyboarded the story by repeating the compass rose over and over again. And that is what's happening in orientation around the user, because you're placing things, and having that sense of the action's relationship to the user is really, really helpful. Yeah.
To be honest, for LARP, at least at the scale that I've typically worked on it, where you've got like up to say 30, 40 people as players, I will be sharing the onboarding, because like what I was talking about was, here's all the information people know in terms of how to play it. Give that to anyone I'm working with, because any holes in that will largely be, well, that's filled in by the players. Mm-hmm. And I kind of just have to ask them to trust players as much as I do. And then like sometimes there's other things that I might show people. It very much depends on the format. For instance, if it's a digitally hosted LARP, like there are a lot that work on Discord or use OBS to feed stuff into Zoom, then I'd show them the physical digital setup. But to be honest, yeah, because so much of LARP is the blank space, I would just share with them what I share with players.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Owen, I guess environmental design is quite important quite early on in the devising stage. Yeah. Does that then sort of impact how you lay down those thoughts initially and share that?
It can do. It depends. It very much depends on the show and who else is working on it. I'm terrible. I write the bare minimum down, and I sort of follow the rule of thumb that if it's important, I'll remember it. And if I didn't remember it, it wasn't that important. But that can be very frustrating to work with. So depending on who else is working on it, how we're working, Parabolic, when it started, I was just a one-man band, really, and I had some mates who we made some shows together. As we've grown, it's become a real team effort, and the rest of the team like using Google Docs, and I hate using Google Docs, but we do it because it does work. It works for them, so that's fine. And so we will keep a lot of disparate notes to start with. And then at some point we start trying to solidify that and bring it together. But most parabolic shows are at least in part devised with the actors who are going to perform them. And so by the time we actually start rehearsals properly, we rarely have anything that looks anything like a script or any scripted material. I have a thing about scripts in that I think when you're interacting with an audience member, if you're an actor and you have pre-written lines that you have learned, your verbal dexterity is going to be up here somewhere. Mm-hmm. And the audience member who is coming to this blind, their verbal dexterity and their lack of confidence is all going to be down here somewhere. So you have a real mismatch, and it makes it very difficult for the audience member to summon up the courage to engage with you because they know they can't match your verbal dexterity. So the only people who do engage with you are drunks and wankers. And what ends up happening is that they try and match the actor's verbal dexterity and fail, and everybody else is watching that. And what you're doing is you're training your audience, the rest of your sensible audience who are not wasted or a wanker, to think, oh, that's what they want us to do. And then you wonder why you've got a bunch of wankers in your show. And it's because you've encouraged them by having all this scripted content, which most ordinary people are never going to be able to match. So we try and avoid scripted content for interaction. And so I just make actors come up with it. And they don't, a lot of actors don't like that, because they like a script. So I tend to work with actors who like working like that.
Do you give them anything in terms of like a world Bible or a character profile, something like that?
It was interesting. I printed out, and I forgot to bring it out. I printed out the documents we had when we went into rehearsal for King and Country. We had an 8-page show plan, and we had about 3 or 4 pages of this is what the world of the Second World War looked like at the time, and our changes to it for the alternate history, and that was it. We have done shows with way more content than that. And often that content then goes on to become part of the world of the show. As in Crisis What Crisis, we had binders full of documents on MPs who were alive at the time and what their voting intentions and preferences were. And obviously an actor can't hold all that in their head, but if it's in the room with them and they know where to find it, that's enough, because a real person wouldn't be able to hold it all in their head. So we do produce a lot of content for some shows where it's needed. And often at the start when we open a show, we haven't got huge amounts of content, but we build as we go. So if you come and see a parabolic show in the first couple of weeks, it might feel a little light on content, but by the time it's been running for 2-3 months, we're bursting at the seams with it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I think you mentioned, a couple of you actually, like that you start off as solo operators, very much steering your own ship. With that, do you find you wear a lot more hats than one? And how, as the team expand, do those roles get broken out? You always have to have one eye on the whole toolkit that's required to create these worlds and experiences. And what kind of roles do you feel actually most adequately represent the skills that are needed?
I mean, we don't talk about writers anymore. I think we did early on, but we don't talk about any one of us being the writer of a show anymore. We've started trying to come up with our own nomenclature for some of this, because immersive theatre has inherited the sort of nomenclature for roles and departments and so on from theatre, or sometimes from other adjacent industries. And actually what it really needs is it needs its own words for things. So we don't really talk about a writer, we talk about an architect, and we talk about a world builder, and they're both functions of a writer, and it could be one person that does both, but they are very different, require a very different mindset, in the same way that if you're writing a novel, creating words on a page and then editing them is 2 completely different mindsets, and you sort of need to flip a switch in your head to flick between the 2. If you try and do them both at the same time, you get yourself in a mess. And I think similarly, if you're coming up with the structure of a show, the mechanics that drive it, that's architecture of the show in my mind, what I would call that. And that's very different to the details of the world building side of it. And there's much more story content in that. But you need to, all of it's writing. So I'll shut up. Yeah.
I mentioned in my talk about kind of facilitator performers, it was just my attempt to try and describe a certain thing, where basically for me, a performer is someone that is playing a role. Their primary thing is to play a role. And a facilitator, their primary thing is to support other people in playing roles. And sometimes I mash that together, largely only when I'm talking to other people making the thing, because facilitator is a really dry term, especially if people are coming from like a theatre audience perspective. And aside from that, I mean, things do get shared around in terms of a lot of the work. When I made The Shield and Torch, which was basically 40 people can come along, there's me and 4 facilitator performers, and they make a character and spend a night in a fantasy tavern, doing whatever they want to do in a fantasy tavern. And those 4 facilitator performers had a lot of leeway. basically we started with, you're the diviner, you're the storyteller, you're the inventor, and you're the barman. And I basically, because I trusted them, I didn't know half the stuff they did because I couldn't possibly, because I couldn't just be with all of them for the whole night because I was also helping out other people. And so we just talked about like the style of what they needed to have. They needed to have interactions that were meaningful. If they were going to send someone somewhere else, it wasn't just to go to another performer and then come back to them. It needed to inform that person's role play and support them interacting with other people. But I just gave them those kind of like basic frames of what that needed to be and then let them do that.
Gina, you talked about how young this medium is. And if you look at like the early days of cinema, the early people who were directing and making films had to know how to do every technical aspect of it. Like they had to know how to operate a camera as well as how to frame a shot, as well as how to motivate actors and do all of it. And then as an industry medium matures, you tend to get specialisms within that to the point that directors may not necessarily need to know how to operate the specialist camera that they're using now. And like specialist roles tend to emerge within that. But I think it's in the nature of the sorts of immersive stuff that we're talking about, partly because it's so hard to even nail down the medium we're talking about, because it's not a medium, it's like a cluster of stuff. I think it's in the nature of what we're talking about that everybody involved has to be involved in the story. This is something I learned from the games industry, that most good game designers are also really good storytellers, even if they can't put pen to paper and put text down, or even if they couldn't be a performer and be witty and inspiring in a corner. Like, everybody who's good at working in this space tends to have a really good instinct for story, from the producer who's resourcing it right down to the actor, to the people who are lighting it and everything, because you have to have an understanding of, for lack of a better word, the dramaturgy, which is like the slippage between the script and the stage and the performers and the audience and how it's actually going to land with them. And you have to have kind of a feel for that. And I think one of the challenges we have to deal with is figuring out structures so that everybody can be productively collaborating when they're all part of the story and all have a stake in the story, without everybody being a writer, especially when you may well not need that role of text person anymore, right? So it's one of the challenges.
Yeah.
But it means you have to know where all the levers are and to be open to letting other people operate your levers as well.
And everybody has to buy into the objective as well, I think, because we have really struggled in the past with stage management. In conventional theatre, if something unexpected happens in a show, it is invariably a problem to be solved by stage management, right? So stage managers are trained with that mindset, and they come into your show with that mindset. The sort of stuff we were making, if something unexpected occurred, that was an opportunity to do something cool. That was something to be encouraged.
Yeah.
So if you've got a stage manager who then wants to shut it down because they see it as a problem, that's a real difficult tension to manage. We had a great guy who did a lot of stage management stuff for us, who died during the pandemic, sadly, but he got it, but I think finding stage managers who get it and who actually want that can be quite hard.
Yeah.
Yeah. Final question before I open up to the audience. There are a lot of people maybe in this room or watching after the fact who may be interested in understanding a little bit more about how your devices can be used when dealing with audiences at scale or relatively fast throughput. Do you have any thoughts on when you work or if you work at scale, how best to maintain the richness of that experience?
I've got a thought. I'm worried that it feels too wishy-washy rather than like, here is a very specific thing that you can go use now and it will work, foolproof, good, 100%. I think sometimes when people are making stuff at scale, people start worrying about the ratio of like, how many performers do we have to audience? Okay, we've got one performer to every 20 audience or something. With something like LARP, it sounds like too easy a thing to say. If you're working at scale and you've got more audience, you've got more people making stuff, you've got more people, you've got a bigger resource. And so if you're thinking in terms of, like I kind of referenced earlier, like some immersive shows, 'cause when I first started out, I was like working on large scale odds and sods with people like Secret Cinema. and you'd say, oh, we've got a quest. Because like, if someone comes to this character, we're going to send them to that actor, they're going to do that thing, then they're going to get sent there, they'll make that thing, and then they might come back to get a reward. I'm not saying that that's necessarily how stuff works now. I don't know the ins and outs, and I don't want to claim that I do. However, if you start thinking in terms of, okay, well, it's not about sending someone to someone else, and then to someone else, and then to someone else. It's about teaching this player something that they can then play with other people. It's about giving this person a reason to go interact with lots of other people. It's not just A to B to C between actors, ricocheting people between actors, because if you get people creating meaningful interactions with other players, suddenly you've got a massive resource. It's less of a problem and more of a thing to just like corral and play with in that way.
Yeah, we've used our techniques. Most parabolic shows are for audiences of under 50. Most of the work we've done to date has been small scale in that regard. We've had a couple of instances where we've had larger audiences in that. One was online, one was physical and in person a few years back. And each time we've had larger audiences in that, essentially what we've done is we've created multiple audiences. So we've had what kind of feels like more than one show running at the same time that interact with each other. So online we created a show called We Have a Situation, which was set on the fictional island of Mazeppa in the Adriatic, and it was an island that had sort of a demarcation down the middle, and the southern half and the northern half hated each other. It's amazing how quickly you can get audiences to hate each other when they don't meet each other directly. It's really fun. And so we had 2 separate Zoom rooms where they ran the first half of the show completely separately. And then they had a summit halfway through because there was a risk of a war breaking out. And they had to send delegates to the summit. And then we had a clever bit of technology which allowed the people in the 2 Zoom rooms to watch what was going on in the 3rd Zoom room but not comment on it. And then the rest of the show played out, and decisions they'd made affected each other's groups. It was a lot of fun. But that allowed us to have an audience of up to 100 in theory. We also did a show in person with an audience of about 250 people. Which we did for one day only. It was a culmination of a sort of an R&D week where we were working with ordinary folk who'd sort of were doing like a theatre summer camp, basically. And that was themed around a Roman siege in modern dress. So one half of the audience were the Romans, and they were recruited into the Roman army. They were given umbrellas as shields and water pistols, and they had to lay siege to this building, which contained the other group, the other army. And it all descended into a water fight at the end. The second half of the show was this massive and elaborate water fight with very tightly controlled rules. It was great fun. But by breaking it down into smaller groups, essentially, we preserved that level of interaction, but then made sure that the groups synced up and were able to communicate and work together. And that relied on the actor facilitators to make that work. But it did work.
Yeah.
Which was great. So I'm just waiting for opportunities to do big, elaborate stuff with this. It just costs a lot of money, and we never have enough money.
Yeah, sort of quickly back to what Chloe said in terms of ratio of audience to performer. Did you have to significantly up your?
We had a lot of performers, and
Yeah.
what worked about that was we'd been working on this show with a bunch of ordinary folk all week, and they were the performers. So we had probably about 40 performers spread around 250 people in the end. But that was pretty good ratio. It worked well for us, and when it got to the water fight, it was absolute carnage, but still managed to maintain a cohesive structure. And given that we only performed it once, we didn't have time to rehearse it properly, and we had 5 days to put it together. Felt pretty good about that. It was enough for me to prove to me that it could work in theory, but we just haven't had a chance to actually do a bigger version of a similar sort of idea. Yeah.
It's a funny one thing about it from the XR technological perspective, because XR and technology is often seen as the way to scale up while keeping your overheads relatively low. Because if the audience has a device on them, like a phone, or if you put a wristband on them, it usually means that in some way or other you can track them. You can track them around the space. You can probably track some of the decisions that they've made. You might be able to send them messages that are for crowd management and to kind of be able to corral them or get them to move from place to place. And you can inject elements of story to them, ideally which reflect back to them choices that they have made thus far through some sort of a branching narrative. And like, designing and managing those is what I love doing, but I think part of trying to understand how to do that well is understanding that that means people looking at their phone rather than looking at each other, which sucks, and that it's never going to be a substitute for the live experience, and that it has to be part of the way in which you are building the persona with which they actually walk through the play space when their phone goes in their pocket. And so you can use it to recontextualize the way they see themselves, the way they see other people. You can use it to introduce parlor game mechanics and have players know something that other players don't, because you can inject it to some players and not to others. You can reflect, you can provide more uniqueness per player and more customization or personalization per player with the same number of actors if everyone's got a device on them. But they are temperamental and they are hard to make work. And if you just want to do it because they're cheaper than actors, it's a world of trouble you're signing yourself up for. And it has to be done as a way of supporting the live experience. Otherwise, you may as well do it at home. So, like, it's a way of scaling up, but it cannot be a way of watering down.
Mm-hmm. Great way to end that little section. Passing over to the audience, does anyone have any questions? We have a person over here on the right, Meredith. If you could speak right into the mic, everyone, so that we can capture it for the
Is that
recording.
close enough?
Great. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Project.
Amazing talk. Thank you so much, everybody. Really, really insightful and interesting. I had a question about serialization. So a lot of the experiences that are being created are happening as one-offs, and I'm sure there's many things that people have heard about today that they wish they could have gone to see. And is there a development to create an experience and then to continue building that world across time and space?
Hold my beer. Hold my beer.
Okay.
Somebody plant you. No, that's what Parabolic's doing next. And we have already done something of that. I mentioned For King and Country earlier. That show actually ended up having two parts. So For King and Country 1940 was about the start of the war, and For King and Country 1944 was about the liberation of Britain by the Americans in a D-Day style thing. And the audience in that were the resistance, breaking into the same bunker that they'd used 4 years previously and finding it had been completely Nazified. So you couldn't look anywhere in the room without seeing a swastika. It's quite intimidating, actually. So we tested it out with that, but then we made something called Bridge Command pre-pandemic, a trial version of a science fiction themed show. And the idea behind that show was to make, to see if we could get the audiences to be the stars of like their own science fiction TV show. So hour-long episodes where you were the bridge crew of a starship, and the starship was fully interactive. You could fly it wherever you wanted. You were given missions, and the idea being that you would reattend later for your next mission, and that it would start to feel like you were Picard or Janeway or whoever on the bridge of your own Enterprise type ship. We did a trial version of that with a very cheap set that made BBC 1970s Doctor Who sets look positively professional. Some places it was literally made out of cardboard, but we wanted to test the tech and we wanted to test that concept. We ran it for 6 months. It was really popular, even though it was very low budget. And we found around 50% of the people who came for the first episode came back for the second. And around 90% of the people who came back for the second episode came back for all of the others, which we ran to 9 different episodes in the end, but we had to close because of the pandemic. That's coming back, and it's coming back in a multi-million-pound version. We got some investors who loved it and have pumped a lot of money into it. So that's what I'm working on at the moment is that. So look out for it. It's been a labour of love, and it's also been like making big shows is hard, man. You know, like the more money you get, you think it make it easier, but it makes it much harder. So yeah, but we're hoping to open that this year. So
Amazing, congratulations! I can't wait to come and see it. So
keep an eye out.
Really
Bridge
exciting.
Command is what we call it.
Who's next?
We've got. Oh. We'll come over there next.
Not to sound
Sorry,
like...
just to finish the thought. What's interesting about episodic stuff is remembering what audiences did and then coming back to it and bringing it back in later when they've reattended. So in For King and Country, the first for King and Country 1940, the events that the audience, on any given night, things that happened we would keep a note of, and then the next night we'd do 44, and if the audiences came back to that, they'd see the results, the decisions they'd made in the first show. And that kind of stuff is magic when you can, doesn't always work perfectly, but when it does work, it's incredible.
I want to very quickly interject this. Shield and Torch was a monthly show, and it was you were coming back to the same tavern, but because we had the very light thing of you're just coming back to a tavern, it was fine if the performers had forgotten you. Their characters had forgotten you, but they were so excited to hear about what you'd done in the intervening month. So there's also stuff like that you can serialize without having to necessarily put loads of work into coming up with a new plot every time, if your players are basically making up all the plot.
Yeah.
Just to add to that before we move on as well, Punch Drunk did an outreach production called The Oracles for Children, where they started in a classroom and they would relay a story through an iPad and a games engine. They would then go to the location, Fallow Cross, which was a replica of what they'd seen on the screen, and they could interact in the space and use beacons and unlock rooms and play games. And then when they went back to the maths class the following week, the environment had changed on the iPad and vice versa. So that's quite an interesting use of tech and gaming and episodes. But sorry, over to you.
And I would say I have my own question, and also to piggyback on that question. So I would love to hear about how you internally notate or organize that process of serialization, of going, okay, well, we're gonna bring that into the next show. How do we organize that and get everyone on board with it and integrate it? And then my other question goes off of something you were already talking about, which is also, and how do we fund it?
Just a small question.
Just a little one. Not to sound like the American in the room, but to sound like the American in the room.
With For King and Country, for that show, we've run it, I think, 3 times now, and for the bulk of the run each time, I've been the person outside, the key decision maker outside, so sort of live direct the show, like the games master person outside the room. And then there's usually an actor in the room who I would call the anchor. If you asked any of the audience members who's in charge here, they'd point to that actor. Yeah, it's the person who feels like they have some degree of authority in the room. And when we decide we're going to drop in a bit of content or do something we've never done before, it's the person outside of the room, the person inside the room coordinate and agree that, so everyone's on the same page. When we were running For King and Country and we were doing the 1940, 1944 thing, largely it was me who'd been the games master every time. So I would just remember, and the next, because we're doing it the next night, and the next night takes the decisions of the previous night, I'd just remember. And if I was in danger of forgetting anything important, I'd just write it down. But following that rule that I mentioned earlier, if I didn't remember it, can't have been that important. It's not an infallible rule, unfortunately. But yeah, make a few notes. I'd leave it in the sort of control room area, and then the next night I'd be able to respond. When we were doing Bridge Command, part of the reason for doing that test was to figure out how to do that. What we're looking at doing for the new iteration of the show is essentially building a database that has a record for each audience member and that ties groups of records together for the ship that they served on together. And then if audience members turn up with a different group of friends, they've also served on a different ship. And we have a way of keeping notes and all that stuff. That's something we're going to develop as we go. We've got a basic thing in place, but as we run, we'll find out, I think, what are the things that we really need to record and what are the things that actually we never end up using. But to give examples of how it has worked, we had one group that came for the test run of Bridge Command, and one of our actors speaks Danish. And in order to communicate with one of our other actors, he just, he wanted to give a bit of a flavour of talking in a European language, who's part of the European Federation, said something in Danish. Happened to be that one of the audience members spoke Danish. And so they then just went off and had a conversation in Danish for a couple of minutes. But we tried to make sure that actor was on every time that group came back, because they built a rapport. And I think that's one of the exciting things, is when audiences start crafting their own narrative because they've built a rapport with the characters that you've given them. We often have, in our sort of show plans, there'll be a particular function that needs to be fulfilled by a character, but exactly who that character is kind of up for grabs. And we had a lot of fun, Chloe was involved in Bridge Command. We had a lot of fun coming up with characters who were the captains of ships and making them slightly eccentric, and trying to, and that often provided little narrative hooks that we didn't necessarily plan in, but emerged as we played with the audience.
No,
I'll go very quickly, serialization funding. I think it might be interesting to look at, there was a LARP that I worked on last year where like the kind of lead creative, though I don't know if she'd like that term because she doesn't like the idea of being the lead, Jen Toxvig kind of put this thing together where people would come every Monday and play together on Discord. And Jen built the most impressive world anvil resource of who was on there, what are their current relationships, etc. It took a lot of time and effort to keep that. I don't know if it always needed that. When you're doing something like Empire, for instance, at that scale, anytime someone like casts a spell, they go to a tent that's called God, and that is put into the system so that they know that spell has been cast, that person has spent the money or resources to do it. But on smaller scale stuff, because it's just you're coming to a tavern, then thankfully you don't have to do much. Or if a tech thing doesn't work, oh, maybe the ghost is still in the tavern because that ritual didn't work last month. In terms of funding, yeah, it's hard.
Find a crazy millionaire.
Yeah, find a crazy millionaire.
That's what we did. Honestly.
Shield and Torch, I'm currently looking into how to fund more of them because the initial run was genuinely funded by leftover sponsorship money from TTRPG actual plays, which is an obscure bit of funding and not, I would say, a reliable way to go about it. But it is the kind of thing where you can get people really invested and really care about stuff. And we had a lot of people asking if they could do it again. And if you can create that serialization, then people are willing to pay because they've bought in another way. That means they care about this world. So, yeah.
So far, the Arts Council won't fund it.
They did fund the broadcast.
Did they?
They funded a LARP specifically exploring how to make LARP that is easier and more accessible for ADHD people. So I have seen things like LARPs funded.
Well done.
I have no idea with the current state of ACE.
Yeah, it's hard.
How many people have or are currently playing tabletop RPGs or LARPs? That is
fewer than I expected.
That is not enough.
Yeah.
To channel Owen for a minute, you need to get the fuck on that because I think it's one of the most valuable references for what we're talking about because there is an incredibly mature and enthusiastically documented format out there that has multiple mature solutions for this question of how you document and archive and remember week on week very mature, sophisticated acts of collaborative imagination. And whatever way in you find, just go on YouTube and start looking for Dungeons & Dragons or start looking for other interesting RPGs or start looking for Vampire, start reading about it, start reading about the theory about it, listen to podcasts. Whatever your way in is, people have been doing this since the 60s and documenting it and being all nerdy about it and being imaginative about it. And it's incredibly important as a reference for everything we're talking about.
I've been playing and games mastering role-playing games for around 30 years. And the way we make our work at Parabolic is heavily, heavily influenced by that. That live curation aspect of it. There are skills there that have come from years and years of presenting players with a beautifully written story and then having them completely ignore it and go and do something else. And learning how to take elements of what you've written but build a narrative cooperatively with the players that they feel invested in and that they feel excited about. And most of the people that Parabolic employ have got some kind of background in role-playing games, really.
Yeah.
Isn't it? It's actually probably more valuable to me than a good drama school education, if I'm honest.
Yeah. And to say really quickly, if money has been the barrier to that, or if time has been the barrier to that, because if you're outside of tabletop games and you're looking at like 50 quid D&D books, go to itch.io, ask me in the bar afterwards, I'll tell you where you can get something you can play in 2 hours with no prep and it won't cost you any money, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Because it is there, it is very much there.
It's crucial. Like it's the equivalent of drama school for the immersive
It
business.
really is, and genuinely, if you apply to work with Parabolic somehow, I couldn't give a fuck what drama school you've been to, honestly. Around half the people we employ have never been to drama school because I don't need you to project because you're going to have conversations with people up close, and I don't need you to learn any lines necessarily, but I do need you to be able to have that kind of way of curating a story that you learn from doing role-playing games. I'd rather you'd spent 20 years, 10 years doing role-playing games solidly than gone to RADA, because it's more useful to me.
But it's not too late to start. Like,
Yeah.
no, just get on it, because it will provide a reference to whatever your art form is. Just get on it. It's like a different lens to view this stuff through.
Just to allow some time for said conversations in the bar, I'm going to move on to the next person, but play role-playing games is the takeaway from that, I think. This person over here with the glasses has a question
Thank
as well.
Hi. It doesn't work.
It's
You
for the
just need to
recording.
Yeah,
speak
just for
in
yeah.
a lot
Sorry.
louder, yeah.
Thank you so much for these conversations. My name is Victor. I'm a creative director in experiential, and part of what I do sometimes involves immersive stuff. Let's say for a immersive museum I'm doing right now. I went to for research. I went to the gunpowder plot. You know about it? Have you been there?
Yeah.
So
No,
the
the VR one.
Oh, the VR show.
Yeah.
Aware of it, haven't
No,
seen
yeah.
it.
I've
not
seen
the
Gunpowder.
VR show, but the one in the tower.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So my question would be, after visiting it, is there some kind of an analog of short film for immersive experiences? Because sometimes immersive experiences is not the means to an end. It's just some part of something. So what's the minimum time to get people into it and out of it and still be enjoyable, let's say?
That's really good.
My pitch for that would be there's a artist collective in America called Meow Wolf who've built things like a Megamart. If you look at a Megamart's YouTube page, Jesus Christ, the quality, the entertainment value of their fake adverts for their supermarket, I genuinely think everyone working in immersive in London or wherever should be watching that, because it's some of the best video content that I've seen that immediately tells me what that world is, that gives me a cool experience. I see you nodding, so I'm sorry that I haven't told you something new.
No.
But yeah, I think
Meow Wolf is something I know. Supermarket, I need to research. But in terms of short film, it means short versions of immersive experience.
Yeah, I think what you're asking is, like, if I was going to go into the film,
micro
if I was
Because,
going to go,
Owen, the experience you told in your presentation, you spent like 5 beats to put people inside, and
Yeah.
each beat is 10
Yeah.
minutes.
yeah, I mean, there are short film equivalents of immersive theatre. That the beat sheet I was sort of showing you there was illustrative of how you can take emotional beats and you don't have to attach them to a specific event, more than me trying to say that every show should follow those exact beats. Yeah, there's lots of ways of structuring a story. I think it's a really interesting point of view to take, for example, Joseph Campbell's Monomyth and apply the same principle to the beats that he outlines, and that would work, I think, in the same kind of way. But I think with short film is a very different experience altogether. I've made loads of short films myself, so I know where you're coming from. I think the one-to-one experience is probably the sort of the smallest version of immersive theatre that you can make, really, where it's just one actor, one audience member, and you have something that maybe lasts 20 minutes, half an hour, maybe even less. And I think that's entirely viable. You probably wouldn't use that style of making it at all. You'd probably do it completely differently. First show we made as Parabolic was a carousel show. Didn't use any of that theory at all. And it was about 20 minutes long. And it was largely a one-to-one thing as well. It was, although it was several people to one actor, but it was a very, very small, contained, largely silent piece as well. It had a lot of music. It was quite inspired by Punch Drunk in some ways. We were trying to do We were trying not to reinvent the wheel with the first thing we made. But I think small. One-on-one is great. One of the best one-on-one things I've ever seen. I can't remember the name of the company. It was actually 2-to-1, so it was 2 actors, 1 audience member, and you were told when you arrived that because you were supposed to be shadowing somebody who was going to do marital counselling with this couple, and the person you were supposed to be shadowing hadn't arrived. And they'd been cancelled on several times before. Would you mind just going in and pretending to be the marriage counsellor because they've never met him in person? Is that okay? And I was like, okay. And I sat down and then had to listen to this couple tell me about their problems with each other. And you kind of had the opportunity to either steer them towards a positive resolution or completely wreck their marriage. And you could do whatever you wanted. And it was really fun. And it was a very simple idea. And it only lasted about 15, 20 minutes, but it was great. Not at all financially viable, but short films aren't either. It's more a calling card of what you can do. So I think that's the sort of thing I would try and make.
Very quickly, there's a film on YouTube. It's called An Internet Story. It's a piece of analog horror, but it's a fake YouTube documentary. And I think there's elements of analog horror where all you have to be is a viewer of a thing. And sometimes it's that voyeuristic wonder if you're going between different YouTube videos and stuff like that. But I think there's a very strong immersive aspect to those. And that video is maybe 12 minutes long. And I would say it's a great piece of immersive video footage.
Both in the sense of something that can be really short and also can be really, really quick and easy to put up and just make. Like, that's partly why people make short films, because film gets more expensive the longer it is, broadly speaking. Something that I get my students to do, and that is a really, really quick and easy way to pop up your portfolio piece that is your short film equivalent to making an immersive show. Just pick a location and then record an audio track for somebody as they walk or move through that location. There is technology that will let you do that and bake in branching narratives and stuff, but just write and record it and then watch people, get them to walk through a space and redefine that space for them by telling them a bit of narrative. Maybe they meet an actor, maybe they don't. Like Janet Cardiff, who's an artist who was making these things in the 90s on tape decks and that you can still download and still play, and they're dramas that recontextualize immersively a location. And you can make that on voice notes today just by picking a location and making a piece of site-specific theatre where the only character is the player and whatever they're listening to.
Okay, one final question. I think there's someone right at the back who's had their hand up for a while in the white jumper. Unfortunately, do we want to keep going? We can go to 10. And then, how long's the bar open? Okay, great. Okay, no, we'll keep going then, if you're happy to.
Hey, folks, thanks so much for today. I think specifically with the notion of writing for immersive, because obviously this could go down a few rabbit holes. So specifically with writing, and within the context of like where you guys are at in your careers and the work that you've made, I was thinking if you were to go back to your first kind of significant or seminal show, LARP, XR piece, what would you change now? Knowing what you do, what would you go back and what would you change narratively?
Nothing. If I can mutate the question a bit, in terms of the advice that I would want to give myself, because the first thing I wrote was like a prototype of a VR experience that no one here will have played. So I iterated within that, even within itself. And I would say that you have to know where the levers are, which means you have to understand that if you're a writer, in Immersive, then you are part of a very, very big system, and the best way to represent the story and make the story happen in the way that you think it should be is to know lots of people and all of the departments throughout that system and to be able to get them to buy into the story so that they're bought in. You need to know who's going to actually make the decision about whether something gets painted or not, and whether that's going to change your story at the last minute. That is part of your business. There is absolutely no writing the script and then walking away because you're the writer and you've handed it off. In terms of narrative, you're part of every part of the process, and being a good narrative person in this space means understanding that everybody else is also part of the narrative. I think you need to. Okay, somebody else.
I've gone. I would go back to the very first show Parabolic made, and I would give the actor who was handling the induction of the audience into the world of the show, I would give him a script. And I say that having said everything I've said tonight about scripted material, because we learned a really important lesson with that show, which is that sometimes you do just need a script, especially when very specific instructions are being given that are important for how the rest of the show is going to run. Because that guy, I made him kind of invent his own dialogue. It gave it a very natural feel, but he was really just delivering instructions. So it could have just been a script. And sometimes you just need instructions to be delivered accurately. Because one night, one of the audience asked him, so should we bring stuff back with us? They were going to go down into a system of tunnels underneath the town hall, which was all like a supernatural thing. They were investigating a supernatural situation. And this audience member said, should we bring stuff back up with us? And he just said, oh, yeah, sure. Not thinking about it at all. Fast forward 20 minutes, and the actor who's going to come out and spook these people finds that they have basically dismantled the set and were piling it up to carry it back upstairs. So yeah, he needed a script.
The first LARP that I wrote / tried to write was never completed because it was an in-person LARP that required at least 8 people to even like playtest elements of it, and it just became impossible to playtest over successive lockdowns. And that's why I ended up not really moving forward with it. And so, to be honest, with that one, I'd just go, write something you can playtest, even if it's really hard to get 8 people in a room. Don't try making a format that you can't even playtest. And also, it's not LARP, it's TTRPG, but the first ever homebrew tabletop campaign that I made, just because I feel like this is relevant, I made several planets, and a history that spanned 100 years, including like the memory wars, and then where there was some time travel, and the cities and the different cultures on the different planets and all that stuff. Write what people are going to encounter and what you're going to need. It's really fun to world build, but sometimes you just don't need to do all of those things. So be efficient with your energy is, what I'd say.
Yeah. To finish off the advice points, so know where the levers are, play to your strengths. This is kind of adapting Owen's point earlier on of like, make what you want to see, and particularly make what you know you can make good with your skills rather than trying to imitate what's already out there, because if you've got a skill and you don't see it out there, you've got a chance to make something unique. And if you try and chase down what you think the market seems to want rather than what you know you can do, you're selling yourself short in a way. So know where the levers are, play to your strengths, and always list things in 3s so that you have time to think of a third thing. What I mean by that is not a point that I've just made up on the spot. No, I mean that you have to delegate to your future self. Because if you're a freelancer, then you probably already know this. You have to be able to trust that if you don't solve this problem tonight, you're better off reading a little bit about it and then going to bed, and you may well wake up with the solution already in your head. But it's because immersive is a very, very, very iterative thing. So if you feel sandbagged or stuck because you haven't found the solution yet, you have to be able to trust your future self to be able to build on what you've done. And it is fine to go to bed on one of these problems, or to leave it with the group, or to wait until a solution emerges in a way that you didn't expect.
And with that, I think we will invite everyone to head to the bar. Thank you, Rob, Chloe, Owen. You're amazing. This is amazing.
And thank you, Sheena.